What happened to the teacher who tried to mess with your disabled child? My 8-year-old daughter Ruby has been deaf since birth. She'd never let it slow her down. But when she started 3rd grade with a new ASL interpreter, she suddenly started signing to me every morning that her stomach hurt and she didn't want to go to school anymore. Ruby came home one day with wet pants and signed she couldn't understand when bathroom time was. I was confused because her interpreter was supposed to be telling her these things. I emailed her teacher asking about Ruby's bathroom accident, and she wrote back that she always announces bathroom breaks clearly, and maybe Ruby wasn't paying attention to Miss Hamilton. I decided to drop by school unannounced to observe Ruby's class through the door window. What I saw made my blood run cold because Miss Hamilton was sitting next to Ruby just moving her hands randomly while the teacher gave instructions about a math worksheet. She wasn't interpreting at all, just making meaningless gestures that looked like sign language to anyone who didn't know ASL. Ruby was staring at her desperately trying to understand, and then looked down at her blank paper while all the other kids started working. I walked into that classroom and signed directly to Ruby asking if she understood the assignment, and she signed back that Miss Hamilton's signs didn't make sense, but she thought something was wrong with her own brain. The teacher looked surprised and said Miss Hamilton had been interpreting everything perfectly. Miss Hamilton immediately started signing real ASL to Ruby, explaining the math problem perfectly, making it look like she'd been doing this all along. I asked to speak with the principal and Miss Hamilton in private. The principal said Miss Hamilton had excellent references and had been working as an interpreter for 5 years. I told them I'd just witnessed her making fake signs instead of interpreting, and Miss Hamilton's face went cold. She said I was mistaken, and that she uses a different dialect of ASL that might look unfamiliar to me. There's no such thing as dialects in ASL that would be that different, but the principal didn't know that. Miss Hamilton said Ruby was struggling because she had processing issues, not because of the interpretation. I demanded to see Ruby's test scores, and they were all failing grades with teacher notes saying Ruby wasn't following directions or completing assignments correctly. The teacher joined us and said she felt bad for Ruby, but some deaf children just couldn't handle mainstream education. Miss Hamilton had been pretending to interpret for 3 months while my daughter sat in complete confusion, unable to learn anything. I found out Miss Hamilton didn't even know ASL fluently, because when I started signing complex sentences to her, she couldn't follow what I was saying. She'd been hired because she knew basic signs and was cheaper than a certified interpreter. The principal admitted they'd been trying to cut special education costs, and Miss Hamilton had come highly recommended by the district as a budget-friendly option. Ruby had been sitting in that classroom for months watching this woman's hands move in meaningless patterns, trying desperately to understand, thinking her own brain was broken. The principal suggested maybe Ruby needed a special needs evaluation because she clearly wasn't thriving. That night, Ruby signed to me that she felt like her brain was broken because everyone else understood Miss Hamilton's signs except her. She thought she was forgetting ASL, her only language. Then Ruby doubled over in pain at dinner and started crying, telling me her stomach was hurting. I rushed her to the emergency room where they did an endoscopy, and the doctor came back with a look on his face I'll never forget. He told me my 8-year-old daughter had stress-induced bleeding ulcers throughout her stomach lining. He asked if she'd been experiencing severe prolonged anxiety or trauma. I sat in that hospital room watching my baby hooked up to IVs and realized Miss Hamilton hadn't just stolen Ruby's education. She'd literally been destroying her from the inside. The physical pain Ruby felt every morning wasn't fake or exaggerated. It was her body breaking down from months of psychological torture. The doctor said he'd only seen ulcers this severe in children who'd experienced extreme abuse or trauma, and he had to report it to social services. When I explained what had been happening at school, he said the sustained confusion and daily failure Ruby experienced was absolutely traumatic enough to cause this level of physical damage. Miss Hamilton had been collecting a paycheck while my daughter's stomach bled from the stress of not understanding her world. I spent the next day researching and discovered Miss Hamilton had been let go from 2 other districts for incompetence but kept getting hired because she was cheap and schools were desperate. 3 other parents of deaf children had filed complaints that went nowhere because the schools claimed their children had learning disabilities, not interpretation issues. The district had been protecting her because admitting she was unqualified meant admitting they'd violated federal law by not providing proper accommodations. I sat there with my daughter's hospital records and a stack of evidence and realized they would keep protecting Miss Hamilton while she destroyed more deaf children. Miss Hamilton was about to learn what happened when you messed with the wrong mother's child. I sat in my car outside the hospital for an hour after Ruby finally fell asleep in her room. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started calling every education lawyer in a 50-mile radius. Most offices were closed at 9 p.m., but I left detailed voicemails about federal law violations and medical evidence of harm. I described my daughter's bleeding stomach to answering machines and tried to keep my voice steady. 3 lawyers had emergency numbers listed, and I called those too. One secretary took my information and said someone would call back within 24 hours. I kept calling until my phone battery dropped to 10%. The next morning, Ruby woke up crying and signing that she was scared to go back to the school where the handlady makes pretend words. I promised her she wouldn't have to see Miss Hamilton again, even though I had no idea how I'd make that happen. The nurse brought Ruby's breakfast of bland foods that wouldn't irritate her ulcers. Ruby picked at the plain toast and asked if she did something wrong to make the handlady mad at her. I typed out an email to the principal with the ER documentation attached and stated Ruby would not return to class until a certified interpreter was provided. His response arrived within an hour, claiming they couldn't make staffing changes mid-semester and suggesting Ruby might benefit from the special education classroom instead. He wrote that some children needed more support than mainstream classrooms could provide. I forwarded his email to the 3 attorneys who had called me back that morning. Albie Bernard called me an hour later after reviewing the medical records I'd sent. He said he'd take our case and immediately sent the district a formal notice about violating the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. He demanded Miss Hamilton's certification documents within 48 hours. He warned me this would make me a target, but said Ruby's medical evidence was the strongest he'd seen in 20 years of education law. I drove to the school district office the next day and used my FERPA rights to request all of Ruby's educational records. I also asked for Miss Hamilton's personnel file and any documentation about interpreter services. The school secretary acted confused and said she needed to check with the principal about what she could release. I handed her Albie's business card and watched her face change. She picked up the phone and called someone while I stood there waiting. 20 minutes later, she handed me a stack of forms to fill out and said the records would be ready in 5 business days. days. That afternoon, the principal called to schedule an urgent meeting about Ruby's situation. He mentioned that Miss Hamilton had been with the district for 3 years without any complaints. I knew he was lying because I'd already connected with 2 other parents online whose kids had struggled with her. I agreed to meet, but insisted Albie attend with me. The principal tried to suggest we didn't need lawyers involved, but I hung up on him. Ruby's GI specialist prescribed a strict treatment plan, including medications that had to be taken 4 times a day. He also gave us a list of dietary restrictions that would take months to heal her stomach lining. He wrote a detailed letter linking her condition directly to prolonged educational trauma and stated she required immediate appropriate accommodations to prevent further harm. The bill for just these 3 days exceeded $8,000. The insurance company wanted more documentation before approving coverage. The meeting with the principal happened 2 days later in the district conference room. Albie asked for Miss Hamilton's ASL certification from an accredited program right away. The principal fumbled with papers and kept saying he was sure everything was in order. He pulled out a folder and flipped through pages while Albie waited. Finally, he admitted she had a certificate of completion from a 2-week online course. Albie's face went stone cold as he started writing notes. The principal tried to explain that Miss Hamilton had experience and good references. Miss Hamilton arrived halfway through the meeting claiming I was targeting her because I was jealous of her connection with Ruby. She said Ruby loved her and always hugged her in the mornings. She attempted to sign while speaking, but her signs didn't match her words at all. Ruby's been signing about stomach pain for months, but suddenly the interpreter can sign perfectly when caught? That timing seems awfully convenient for Miss Hamilton. The principal backing her up while admitting they hired her for budget reasons makes me wonder what else the district is hiding from parents. Albie's assistant, who knew ASL, documented everything on video with her phone. Miss Hamilton didn't realize she was recorded and kept making nonsense gestures while talking about how much she cared about Ruby. She said I was making Ruby's problems worse by being overprotective. She signed something that looked like elephant purple swimming while saying she was explaining her qualifications. The assistant kept recording while Miss Hamilton dug herself deeper. I got a Facebook message that night from someone named Alfie Richter, whose son had been in Miss Hamilton's class the previous year. His son had developed severe anxiety and stopped using ASL at home after 6 months with her. The boy thought he was forgetting his own language just like Ruby and now required therapy twice a week. Alfie said his son would cry when anyone tried to sign to him because he thought his brain was broken. We started a group chat and within 2 hours, 4 other parents had joined. Each family had a similar story about their deaf child struggling with Miss Hamilton and the school claiming the child had learning disabilities. One mother said her daughter had started hitting herself in the head during class because she couldn't understand anything. Another parent's son had developed a stutter in his signing from the stress. The pattern was clear and we all had documentation. Albie said we had enough for a class action lawsuit. The next meeting came 3 days later and this time the district brought their special education director, who sat across from us with a thick folder and a fake smile. She started talking about how Miss Hamilton was a dedicated paraprofessional who'd been learning on the job and trying her best with limited resources. Albie pulled out his own folder and showed her the federal requirements stating interpreters must be qualified before they start working with students. The director's smile got tighter and she shifted in her chair before saying, maybe we should evaluate whether Ruby really needed an interpreter at all. My hands started shaking and I could feel my face getting hot as she suggested Ruby might do better in a self-contained classroom. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor and walked out before I said something that would hurt our case. The hallway was empty and cold, and I leaned against the wall trying to breathe while listening to Albie's calm voice through the door. 20 minutes later, he came out and told me the district was offering homebound instruction while they reviewed our concerns. The next morning, a box of worksheets arrived at our door with a note saying Ruby would receive packets weekly until the situation was resolved. Ruby sat at our kitchen table staring at math problems about fractions when she'd never learned basic division because Miss Hamilton hadn't interpreted those lessons. The science worksheet asked about the water cycle using words Ruby couldn't read yet because she was still learning English as her second language. I spent 4 hours that first day trying to explain 3 months of missed lessons while setting timers for Ruby's ulcer medication every 6 hours. She kept signing that her head hurt from trying to understand so much at once, and her stomach still burned even with the medicine. We worked through lunch because there was so much to catch up on, and Ruby's tears kept dropping onto the worksheets, making the ink run. 3 days into homeschooling, a social worker knocked on our door saying she needed to do a mandatory home visit following the hospital's report. She walked through our house taking notes on her clipboard and asking why I hadn't noticed Ruby's distress sooner if I was such an involved parent. I showed her the folder with 43 emails I'd sent to the school starting from Ruby's second week with Miss Hamilton. She flipped through them quickly and said she still needed to complete a full investigation, including interviews with Ruby's teachers and medical providers. Ruby watched from the stairs as this stranger wrote things about our family, and I saw her signing to herself that everything was her fault. The social worker said she'd be back next week and needed to see Ruby's bedroom and talk to her alone with a certified interpreter present. 2 weeks later, Albie called saying the district finally responded to our records request by delivering 4 boxes of documents to his office. I drove over and we spent 6 hours going through observation notes where every single one blamed Ruby for not paying attention or refusing to participate. Miss Hamilton's daily logs were almost identical for 3 months straight, with the same phrase copied over and over about successfully interpreting all classroom instruction. Albie spread them out on his conference table and showed me how the timestamps were all entered at the same time each Friday afternoon. The pattern was so obvious that even I could see someone had filled out 3 months of documentation in one sitting to cover their tracks. The next evening, Ruby's teacher sent me an email from her personal account saying she needed to tell me something off the record. She admitted she'd noticed Ruby struggling from the beginning, but administration told her Miss Hamilton was fully qualified and she shouldn't question their hiring decisions. She wrote that during parent conferences, Miss Hamilton couldn't interpret basic questions about Ruby's progress and just kept nodding and smiling. The teacher had brought it up with the principal, who said she was being too critical and needed to give Miss Hamilton time to adjust. I forwarded everything to Albie immediately, and he said this was exactly the evidence we needed to show the school knew there was a problem. A week later, the district called with what they called a reasonable compromise for Ruby's education going forward. They wanted her to attend virtual classes from home using automated captions instead of returning to the school with a proper interpreter. I tried explaining that ASL was Ruby's first language, and she couldn't read fast enough to follow captions meant for hearing kids. The woman on the phone sighed like I was being difficult and said they were trying to accommodate us, but I was making it impossible. Ruby was sitting next to me during the call and started signing frantically, asking if she did something wrong to make everyone angry. That afternoon, Lynette called me with information she'd been gathering about Miss Hamilton's work history. She'd found out Miss Hamilton was quietly let go from her previous district after multiple parent complaints, but those records were sealed. Lynette had documentation showing 3 formal complaints that were never investigated because Miss Hamilton threatened to sue for discrimination. She said Miss Hamilton claimed the parents were biased against her because she was still learning ASL and needed more time. The pattern was exactly the same at every school where Miss Hamilton worked for a few months before parents started complaining. Albie took all this new evidence and filed formal complaints with the State Education Agency and the Office for Civil Rights. He warned me the investigations could take months, and the district would probably retaliate by scrutinizing everything about our family. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got a letter questioning Ruby's attendance records and asking for doctor's notes for every absence, including when she was hospitalized. They wanted proof that her medical issues were real, and not just excuses to keep her out of school. The next morning, I mentioned to Ruby that maybe she could go back to the school with a different interpreter once everything was sorted out. She started breathing fast and signing so frantically I could barely understand her, saying she never wanted to go back to the place where words disappeared. Her stomach pain came back immediately, and she ran to the bathroom where I heard her throwing up from the stress. Her therapist called it post-traumatic stress and said Ruby associated school with confusion and pain that would take months to address. The principal sent a certified letter that same week stating that due to our hostile and aggressive communications, all future contact must go through the district's legal department. This meant I couldn't even email about homework or ask questions about Ruby's assignments without going through lawyers who took days to respond. Albie said this was typical intimidation meant to make parents give up and go away, but we weren't going anywhere. The next morning, I called the district office to ask about Ruby's services, and the secretary let slip that Miss Hamilton was still drawing her full salary while on administrative leave. My hands shook as I typed a post in our local parent support group about what was happening. Within 2 hours, my inbox filled with messages from 3 other families whose deaf kids had been assigned unqualified interpreters. The district hired cheap. One mom sent me videos of her son's supposed interpreter just waving her hands around while the teacher talked. Another family had documentation showing their daughter's grades dropped from A's to F's after getting a budget interpreter. We started a shared folder and began collecting every piece of evidence we could find. The district called an IEP eligibility meeting for Ruby, and when I walked into that conference room, they had 8 people sitting on their side of the table. The special education director started by asking if Ruby had been evaluated for cognitive delays before. I pulled out my phone and played a video of Ruby signing a complex story about dragons and princesses with perfect grammar and vocabulary. The room went quiet as they watched my 8-year-old use advanced ASL concepts that most hearing adults couldn't understand. They spent another 40 minutes trying to suggest Ruby had processing disorders or attention problems. Meanwhile, the medical bills kept coming in thick envelopes that made my stomach drop every time I saw them. It's so interesting how Miss Hamilton signed elephant purple swimming while claiming she knew ASL. I wonder if she even realized how random those signs were, or if she thought they made sense somehow. Ruby needed weekly appointments with the GI specialist to monitor her ulcers. The therapy sessions cost $200 each, even with insurance. I spread the bills across my kitchen table and calculated we were looking at $12,000 in medical costs, directly caused by the school's negligence. Albie added every receipt and invoice to our formal complaint, while the district kept sending form letters saying they weren't responsible for any medical expenses. Alfie posted about the pattern of harm in a local education blog, and while it didn't go viral, it got picked up by enough people that school board members started getting emails. The district's PR person sent out a statement calling us a small group of dissatisfied parents trying to disrupt the educational process. 2 days later, I got a notification that Miss Hamilton had applied for unemployment benefits. She claimed she was discriminated against for having a learning disability that made it hard for her to remember complex hand movements. The woman who destroyed my daughter's health was now claiming to be the victim. She started posting on social media about being bullied by entitled parents who didn't understand how hard interpreting was. People who didn't know the full story started commenting support for her. The independent reviewer the district hired finally scheduled an interview with me 3 weeks after everything started. She sat across from me taking notes as I showed her Ruby's medical records and the videos of fake interpreting. Her face changed when she saw the endoscopy photos of Ruby's bleeding stomach. She asked detailed questions about Ruby's daily experience and seemed genuinely disturbed by what she was hearing. Then she mentioned her contract required her to find solutions that work for all parties involved. That sounded like code for making this go away quietly. Ruby started seeing a new therapist who specialized in trauma in deaf children. The therapist immediately recognized what she called language deprivation anxiety and explained that Ruby had been gaslit for months. Every day, Ruby's perception of her own language was invalidated by meaningless hand movements she was told were real signs. The therapist said it would take months just to rebuild Ruby's basic trust in her ability to understand ASL. The school board meeting came up and I practiced my 3-minute speech over and over. I stood at that podium and described my 8-year-old's bleeding ulcers while the board members looked at their phones. I talked about the other children whose education was stolen by fake interpreters hired to save money. 2 board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the president just thanked me for my input and called the next speaker without any discussion. Nobody asked questions or showed any concern. A week later, the district offered mediation with a proposal that made my blood boil. They would provide a certified interpreter for the rest of the year if we signed a non-disclosure agreement and waived our right to sue. Albie read through the document and pointed out the NDA would prevent us from warning other parents or pursuing any accountability. The district wanted to buy our silence for the price of what Ruby should have had all along. I declined their offer knowing this meant months more of fighting. Ruby tried going back to the school for one day with a substitute interpreter the district found at the last minute. She came home exhausted and signed that the interpreter was good, but she kept waiting for the signs to stop making sense. Every time the interpreter moved her hands, Ruby tensed up expecting the meaning to disappear. That night, Ruby's stomach pain came back so bad she couldn't eat dinner. I held her while she cried and realized the trauma wasn't just about language anymore. My daughter had learned that the adults who were supposed to help her might be lying to her face. She couldn't trust that what she understood was real, because for months, she'd been told her understanding was wrong, when it was actually right all along. The next morning, I got a call from Albie saying the State Education Board had opened an investigation into Miss Hamilton's teaching certificate after we filed our formal complaint. Within 3 days, she'd hired her own lawyer who sent us a letter claiming Miss Hamilton was never properly trained by the district and was basically set up to fail. Now the district's attorney had to fight on 2 fronts, defending against our lawsuit while also defending against Miss Hamilton's claim that they'd thrown her under the bus. School pickup became a nightmare where parents would see me coming and suddenly find something interesting to look at on their phones. I heard whispers about how I was making things difficult for everyone and causing problems that affected the whole school. One mom grabbed my arm and said her son had been telling her for months that Ruby looked lost in class, and she was glad someone was finally doing something. The Office for Civil Rights showed up at the district office 2 weeks later with a team of investigators who demanded 5 years of records about interpreter services. They found 14 other cases where unqualified interpreters had been hired for deaf and hard of hearing students to save money. The district scrambled to show they'd recently updated their policies, but the investigators saw right through it since nothing had actually changed except some paperwork. Ruby's teacher suddenly announced she was transferring to another school for personal reasons, even though it was the middle of the school year. Her replacement was this young teacher fresh out of college who'd never worked with a deaf student before, but at least she asked me for resources and websites about teaching Ruby. Starting over with a new teacher meant Ruby lost even more learning time while they figured each other out. Then Emily Hoffman called me saying she could work with Ruby temporarily while all the legal stuff got sorted out. Emily was a certified interpreter from the next district over who actually knew ASL fluently and had 20 years of experience. Ruby came home that first day with Emily signing, so fast I could barely keep up, telling me about the science experiment they did, and the book they read, and how math finally made sense. My heart broke watching her excitement because it showed me exactly how much she'd been missing all those months with Miss Hamilton. The district's insurance company sent their own team of lawyers to assess how much this might cost them in damages. These insurance lawyers seemed way more worried about the potential payout than the district's attorneys were, and suddenly the district became interested in discussing permanent solutions. Money always talks louder than children's needs, apparently. Miss Hamilton posted a GoFundMe claiming she was a victim of discrimination and needed help with legal fees, since she was just a hardworking educator being attacked by an angry parent. She raised $3,000 in 2 days before other parents started commenting with their own stories about their kids struggling in her classes. One parent posted screenshots of emails where Miss Hamilton admitted she didn't understand their child's IEP requirements, and the GoFundMe disappeared within hours. Miss Hamilton's lawyer then sent cease and desist letters to anyone who posted about her online threatening defamation lawsuits. Ruby's next endoscopy showed her stomach lining was healing, but the doctor warned us that any return to a stressful environment could trigger the ulcers again immediately. He wrote another detailed letter for our case stating that Ruby absolutely could not return to a traumatic educational environment without proper support, or she risked permanent damage to her digestive system. The district's lawyer actually questioned whether a medical doctor was qualified to make educational recommendations, which made even the judge roll his eyes during the hearing. I sat down one night and calculated that I'd spent over 200 hours fighting for basic accommodations that should have been automatic under federal law. Between lawyer meetings and doctor appointments and documenting everything and teaching Ruby at home when she couldn't handle school, I'd had to cut my work hours in half. My boss was understanding, but understanding doesn't pay bills, and the financial strain was adding another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. The IEP team finally scheduled a meeting where they agreed Ruby qualified for services, which we'd been saying from the beginning. But then they offered only part-time interpretation services, claiming that full-time interpretation wasn't educationally necessary for a 3rd grader. Albie immediately threatened to file an emergency injunction, and suddenly they discovered they had budget flexibility for full-time services after all. Every single accommodation required threats of legal action, and it was exhausting knowing that without Albie we would have gotten nowhere. The principal kept saying they wanted what was best for Ruby while simultaneously fighting against every single thing that would actually help her. 2 weeks later, Miss Hamilton handed in her resignation letter saying she needed to care for a sick relative out of state. The district gave her a neutral reference letter that didn't mention any of the problems, and she packed up her apartment within days. I found out through a parent support group online that she'd moved to Nebraska and was already applying for interpreter positions at 3 different school districts there. I contacted every deaf advocacy group in Nebraska I could find and sent them copies of Ruby's medical records and failing grades, but they all said the same thing. Without an official finding of incompetence from our district, there wasn't much they could do except keep an eye on her applications. Miss Hamilton claiming she has a learning disability that makes it hard to remember hand movements after pretending to know ASL for months? That's quite a convenient discovery right when she needs unemployment benefits. I'm curious about this timing. The best they could offer was to alert parents in those districts to be vigilant if she got hired. Meanwhile, Ruby started working with Emily every single day at the school, and the change was immediate but fragile. She'd sign a question to Emily about the lesson, and then immediately sign it again, asking if she understood it right, then ask a 3rd time if Emily was sure. Emily would patiently confirm each time that Ruby's understanding was perfect, and remind her that her brain worked exactly as it should. Some days Ruby would check her understanding 20 times in a single class period, and I could see the exhaustion on Emily's face from constantly reassuring her. The social services investigation that the hospital started finally wrapped up after 6 weeks of interviews and home visits. The social worker sat in my living room with her final report and told me there were no findings of abuse or neglect on my part. She actually looked uncomfortable as she explained that they recommended ongoing monitoring of Ruby's emotional well-being through her therapist. Then she closed her folder and said quietly that she could see how badly the system had failed my daughter, and she was sorry. I was too tired to feel anything about her apology. The parent coalition we'd formed was seeing different results across the board, which made everything feel even more unfair. Alfie managed to get his son transferred to a school with a properly certified interpreter after threatening his own lawsuit. Lynette's daughter was still stuck with an inadequate interpreter because she couldn't afford a lawyer, and the district knew it. We met every week at the library to share resources and strategies, but the inequality was obvious and frustrating. Those of us with lawyers or money got results while those without got ignored. 3 months months after Miss Hamilton left, the district sent out a press release about their new enhanced standards for interpreter hiring. They'd now require certification from accredited programs and regular competency evaluations for all special education support staff. The school board held a special meeting where they patted themselves on the back for their proactive commitment to special education excellence. Not one person mentioned why these changes were suddenly necessary or acknowledged the kids who'd already been harmed. Ruby's therapy sessions happened twice a week in a small office with toys and art supplies scattered around. The therapist worked on helping Ruby trust her understanding of language again through games and activities. She told me Ruby was showing good signs of recovery, but would need support for at least a year to fully rebuild her confidence. When I asked if there would be lasting effects, she said children could be remarkably resilient when properly supported, but only time would tell. Every session cost $150, and insurance only covered half. The state education agency's investigation report came out 4 months after Albie filed the complaint. They found the district in violation of 12 different federal requirements for special education services. But instead of immediate penalties, they gave the district a full year to correct the problems with monthly progress reports. The district would also need to provide additional training for all staff on federal disability laws. It felt like they'd burned down Ruby's education and gotten told to please be more careful with matches in the future. Then a certified letter arrived from a law firm in Nebraska representing Miss Hamilton. She was threatening to sue me for defamation if I continued telling people about her incompetence and lack of qualifications. The letter claimed I was maliciously destroying her career prospects with false allegations. Albie immediately wrote back attaching Ruby's medical records showing the stress ulcers, her failed grades from those months, and Emily's assessment of Ruby's capabilities. He explained that truth was an absolute defense to defamation and suggested Miss Hamilton focus on actually learning ASL instead of threatening families she'd harmed. We never heard from her lawyer again, but the stress of potentially being sued on top of everything else made my stomach hurt constantly. By May, Ruby was finishing 3rd grade with Emily interpreting every lesson perfectly. Her grades had jumped from failing to A's and B's within weeks of getting proper interpretation. She still needed summer school to catch up on all the foundational concepts she'd missed during those months with Miss Hamilton. Her teacher wrote in the final report card that Ruby was bright, eager to learn, and had exceptional problem-solving skills when properly supported. The same teacher who'd suggested Ruby couldn't handle mainstream education was now praising her abilities. The district's lawyers finally presented their settlement offer after 7 months of negotiations. They'd pay all of Ruby's medical bills from the Ulcers, provide certified interpretation through her entire education, including high school, and give her 30 hours of compensatory education services for what she'd missed. They admitted no wrongdoing and required us to sign a partial non-disclosure agreement. We could discuss the facts of what happened, but not the specific settlement terms or amount. Albie said this was the best we'd get without spending years in court and probably $50,000 in legal fees. I signed the papers the next week with my hand shaking as I wrote my name. The check covered Ruby's medical bills and guaranteed she'd have a certified interpreter through high school, but the district admitted nothing. Other parents from our group called me that night asking if this meant their cases were over too. I couldn't give them answers because the lawyers made it clear this was just for Ruby. 3 weeks later, Lynette found out Miss Hamilton was working at a daycare center 2 states over. She'd sent me the Facebook post showing Hamilton smiling with a group of toddlers at story time. My hands went cold seeing her touching those kids' shoulders the same way she'd touched Ruby's. I called that state's licensing board immediately and spent 40 minutes explaining everything that happened. The woman on the phone said without criminal charges or official findings against Hamilton, they couldn't take action based on allegations from another state. I hung up and threw my phone across the room so hard it cracked the screen. Ruby started 4th grade in September with Emily as her interpreter, and everything felt different from day one. She came home that first day signing so fast about her science project that I had to ask her to slow down. The medicine for her stomach made her tired sometimes, but she took it every morning without complaint. Her therapist met with her twice a week in a small office with toys and art supplies where Ruby drew pictures of her classroom. The Office for Civil Rights sent their final report in October stating the district needed better training and monitoring systems. They required quarterly reports and mandatory ASL competency testing for all interpreters, but no one lost their job. The same special education director who hired Hamilton still ran the department. Our parent group kept meeting every month at the library, even though half the families had given up on getting justice. We spent hours writing a guide for parents explaining their rights and warning signs to watch for. Lynette designed a website while Alfie contacted every deaf organization in 3 states to spread the word. One night while doing homework, Ruby looked up and asked me why Miss Hamilton pretended to know sign language. I sat there trying to find words that wouldn't make her more confused or angry. I told her sometimes adults make bad choices that hurt kids, but it was never Ruby's fault. She thought about this for a long time, then signed that Hamilton must have a hurt stomach too from all the lying. By spring, Ruby's test scores showed she was reading at grade level in everything except English where she needed extra help. Her GI doctor ran new tests and said the ulcers had healed, but she'd need to stay on maintenance medication. He showed me the before and after images of her stomach lining, and the difference made me cry right there in his office. The school concert happened in May, with Ruby's class performing 3 songs with hand movements. Emily stood at the side of the stage interpreting every word while Ruby signed along with huge movements. When Ruby spotted me in the 3rd row, she waved so hard she almost hit the kid next to her. The other parents smiled at her enthusiasm, while I sat there remembering the silent confusion she'd lived in for months. The anger at Hamilton and the district burned in my chest even while I clapped for my daughter. After the concert, Ruby ran to me signing about how fun it was to understand all the words this time. She didn't need to say what she meant by this time, because we both remembered the winter concert where she'd stood frozen and lost. That night, I watched her sleep peacefully without the stomach pain that used to wake her up crying. The settlement money sat in an account for her future, while the people who'd hurt her kept their jobs, and Hamilton kept working with other people's children somewhere else. What a ride that was. Really appreciate you being here while we explored all those fascinating questions together. Until next time, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.